Good evening, dear listener. I hope you're feeling comfortable, tucked away from the world as the night deepens around us. And if you're one of my familiar companions, welcome back. I hope your day has been as kind to you as the soft glow of the stars above. Feel free to close your eyes and let the soft crackle of the fire and gentle sound of the night lull you to sleep. I'd love to know where and when you're tuning in from tonight. Leave a comment below with the time and place you're watching from. Tonight, we're going to step into the shadowed realm of myth and mystery, guided by the haunting tale of Medusa. What was it that truly made her a monster, you might wonder? Was it the way her gaze could turn the living into cold, unfeeling stone? The writhing snakes that crowned her head like a twisted halo? Or perhaps, was it her very nature, her womanhood, that marked her as something to be feared? But beneath those layers, something much deeper lingers. Medusa was a victim, transformed by the pain and cruelty she endured. And yet, she survived. No, she grew stronger. The trauma that might have shattered her instead gave her power. Power that would terrify the world around her. If we were to peel back the surface of the human psyche, diving into its darkest corners, we might find there the image of Medusa's severed head. Its gaze still potent, whether lying on the ground, gripped by the hair in her murderer's hand, or forever captured on the gleaming shield of Athena. Artists like Caravaggio have immortalized her in their work. Her tragic image, a reflection of female sexuality, twisted and contorted by centuries of the male gaze. For generations, Medusa has been both feared and dissected. Her anger and her powers viewed through lenses both harsh and empathetic, misogynistic and feminist alike. Yet, there is so much more to her than these modern readings. Her story, her symbols, stretch back farther than many realize. So, dear listener, as the night settles in and the world grows quieter, let us journey together into the myth of the Gorgon. One of the earliest depictions of such a creature can be found on the amphora of Nessus, resting in the Archaeological Museum of Athens. Here we find a Gorgon not unlike Medusa, a creature with mighty wings, a broad, flattened head, a mouth filled with fangs, and a tongue forever thrust forward in a grotesque snarl. Her mane, wild and untamed, crowns her monstrous form. But before we delve too deeply into Medusa herself, it's worth noting that even Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, long before Medusa became a household name, spoke of a Gorgon much like her. In these ancient epics, written around 750 BCE, we find mention of an unnamed Gorgon, her fearsome image emblazoned on the aegis of Athena. A shield meant to strike terror into the hearts of those who dared face her. As we explore the ancient texts, we find that the aegis, a powerful symbol of protection, could be interpreted in many ways. Often, it was seen as a shield, though some believed it to be the skin of an animal. Its surface adorned with fearsome images meant to strike terror into the hearts of the gods' enemies. Athena's aegis, in particular, was said to carry upon it the head of a terrible monster, a fearful portent held by Zeus himself. In Homer's Iliad, the Gorgon is not yet described with the familiar image we know today. No snakes for hair, no wings to carry her through the skies. Yet, even then, her presence evoked dread. Agamemnon's shield bore her fearsome visage, a ferocious face with dreadful glance, surrounded by terror and flight. A dark blue snake coiled about her, the symbol of danger and death clinging to her image, like the creeping shadows of the underworld. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus, in the depth of his journeys, speaks of the Gorgon with a sense of growing fear, his words carrying the cold breath of Hades itself. A pale, yellow-green dread seized me, he says, imagining the head of the Gorgon, sent forth from the house of the dead by Persephone, queen of the underworld. And yet, at this time in history, Medusa herself had not yet emerged in the tales of Perseus. It is fascinating to note, dear listener, that the myth of Medusa, as we know it, was not part of the stories woven into the Iliad or the Odyssey, even though Gorgons are mentioned. It wasn't until around 700 BCE, in Hesiod's Theogony, that the two, the hero Perseus and the monster Medusa, were linked together, forming the myth that has endured throughout time. In Hesiod's words, Medusa, who was once immortal, suffered miseries, while her two sisters, Thano and Euryale, were immortal and ageless, forever beyond the grasp of death. But it was Medusa who captured the attention of the gods. With this woman, Medusa, Hesiod wrote, "Lay the dark blue-haired one, Poseidon, in a soft meadow, in the midst of the spring flowers." The story of her violation at the hands of Poseidon would become one of the central tragedies of her life, a key to understanding her transformation from beauty to monster. This moment, dear listener, is important to remember as we continue, for it will echo later in her story. Throughout the ancient texts, there are variations of Medusa's tale. Some told by Hesiod, others by Apollodorus, Ovid, and Lucan. The core of the myth remains the same. Medusa, once a beautiful mortal woman with long flowing hair, was devoted to Athena, serving as one of her virgin priestesses. But even as she served, her fate would be sealed by the cruel hand of destiny. The name Medusa, as Merriam-Webster explains, comes from ancient roots meaning the ruling one, a name that suggests power, authority, but also, perhaps, the tragedy of being ruled by forces beyond her control. In Hesiod's poetry, Medusa is not only the lone mortal among the Gorgon sisters, but also a figure linked with the underworld. Her name, derived from the word Gorgos, means terrible, fierce, and frightful. Yet, despite this association with horror, Medusa was once so beautiful that she captured the heart of the god Poseidon. He, the ruler of the seas, was said to have fallen in love with her, drawn to her beauty like the tides to the shore. According to Ovid, Poseidon did not court Medusa, but instead violated her, forcing himself upon her within the sacred walls of Athena's temple. This act of desecration left Athena furious, but her anger was not directed at Poseidon, the god who had committed the crime, but at Medusa herself, the victim of the assault. Athena, in her wrath, cursed Medusa with the monstrous form that has become so familiar, transforming her beauty into a terrifying ugliness. Her flowing hair became a nest of venomous snakes, forever writhing, and her gaze was given the power to petrify all who met it, turning them to cold, unfeeling stone. This curse, my dear listener, was not just a transformation. It was a form of punishment, cruel and unjust, for a crime Medusa had not committed. It is a story that speaks to the harshness of the ancient world, where even the innocent could be punished for the sins of others. This version of events stands in stark contrast to the tale told by Hesiod, where Poseidon and Medusa shared a moment of passion, making love in a peaceful meadow of spring flowers. No temple, no violence, just the union of a god and a mortal beneath the soft caress of nature. And yet, these two versions, Ovid's and Hesiod's, are but different shades of the same myth, each reflecting the complexities of ancient storytelling, where truth shifts and changes like the flickering light of a campfire. Many scholars believe that Ovid deliberately moved the setting of Medusa's tale to Athena's temple to explain why the goddess later bore the image of Medusa's severed head upon her aegis. Athena, after all, had become closely associated with the image of the Gorgon, using it as a symbol of fear and protection. But as with all myths, there is no singular, definitive version of the story. In Hesiod's Theogony, for example, there is no mention of Medusa's hair turning into snakes. That element of her story emerged later, as myths evolved and changed with the times. By the time the poet Pindar was writing his odes, around 500 BCE, serpents had become a permanent feature of Medusa's monstrous form, both in literature and in art. And with those serpents came the power of petrification. Medusa's infamous ability to turn humans, and eventually even animals, to stone with a single glance. The horror of her transformation was now complete, and her power over life and death, though tragic, was absolute. We can trace the evolution of Medusa's myth further through the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived between 560 and 420 BCE. Herodotus not only linked Perseus and the Gorgon, but also placed their fateful encounter in Libya, suggesting that the story may have traveled from Egypt. According to the people of Chemmis, Perseus came to Egypt to slay Medusa, before bringing her head back to Greece. This version of the myth reminds us of how stories, like the wind, cross borders and change with each retelling, adapting to the cultures and times in which they are told. As we move into the classical period of Greece, the image of the Gorgon became a common motif, not only in myth but in architecture. City walls and temples were often adorned with the image of the Gorgon as an apotropaic symbol, meant to ward off evil and protect the people within. During this time, around 480 to 407 BCE, the playwright Euripides wrote his famous plays, including Ion, where he made several references to the Gorgon's head. In one passage, the Queen of Athens, Creusa, describes a richly embroidered robe, noting how it is adorned with the image of a Gorgon, surrounded by serpents, just like the aegis of Athena. But Euripides' writings also give us a glimpse into another aspect of Medusa's myth: the mysterious power of her blood. In Ion, the queen speaks of 2 drops of blood taken from Medusa. These drops, much like the venom of a snake, have different effects. One drop, she says, is lethal, capable of bringing death to anyone it touches. The other, however, is a powerful healer, able to cure and bring life where there was none. Of course, this doesn't reflect how blood flows in the body as we understand it today. But the symbolism is clear. Medusa's power was not simply one of death, but of balance between destruction and salvation. Apollodorus also provided a more detailed and vivid image of the Gorgon. He described Medusa and her sisters with heads encircled by the scales of serpents. Their large, boar-like teeth jutting from their mouths. It's likely that the tusks of boars are being referenced here, a symbol of ferocity and the untamed power of nature. Medusa's hands, made of bronze, glimmered like metal forged in fire, and her wings were of gold, allowing her to soar through the skies. An image that brings to life the strange blend of beauty, terror, and otherworldliness that Medusa embodied. Her gaze, of course, retained its petrifying power, capable of turning anyone who looked upon her into stone, freezing them in the stillness of death. This particular image connects to ancient European and Near Eastern traditions, where creatures and deities with snake and bird symbolism were associated with death and the spirit world. In the Neolithic cultures of these regions, bird women, snake women, and even hybrid bird-snake women figures appear frequently in religious iconography, representing forces of nature that encompassed both life and death, much like Medusa herself. The scholar Miriam Dexter suggests that these figures from early European and Near Eastern history likely represent divine beings, much like the later goddesses in Egypt and Mesopotamia. One example of this is found in the ancient Sumerian myth, The Descent of Inanna, in which the goddess of the underworld, Ereshkigal, embodies the harsh, life-ending aspects of divinity, while also being in the process of giving birth, symbolizing a link between death and rebirth. Medusa, too, shares these dualities, her wings connecting her to the avian, her snaky hair linking her to the serpentine, reflecting the ancient Neolithic goddesses who were said to embody both life and death in their forms. As we delve deeper into these myths, we see that in Neolithic Europe, death and rebirth were often tied together through ritual, particularly in tombs, which were seen not only as places of death but also as symbolic wombs where the deceased might be reborn. Medusa, in her fearsome form, represented this connection between death and rebirth. Those who gazed upon her were turned to stone, frozen in a kind of stasis, their lives and activity forever halted. Yet, within that stone-like stillness, there is the echo of something deeper, the possibility of transformation. It's not just Medusa who carried these symbolic ties to snakes and birds. Many Indo-European myths feature female monsters with similar iconography. In the Baltic traditions, for example, witches, known as Raganas, were said to take the form of crows, their hair entangled with snakes, much like the Gorgons. In the works of Virgil, particularly in the Aeneid, other fearsome figures such as the Furies, the Dairi, the Sirens, and the Harpies are all connected to the imagery of snakes and serpents, often depicted with wings, just like Medusa. It's interesting to note that Medusa's wings were not an original part of her myth. They were added by the Greeks around 800 BCE, and from that point forward, Medusa has been consistently described as winged in many classical texts. The addition of wings placed her firmly within the realm of divine and monstrous beings, capable of moving between worlds. The mortal and the immortal, the living and the dead. There is also a significant portrayal of Medusa from Miletus, in which, though she is associated with snakes, she does not have the fully serpentine body that some later depictions grant her, Instead, she retains the human form, but is adorned with the serpent imagery, much like the ancient bird-snake goddesses. She became, in this portrayal, an embodiment of the great goddess who governed birth, death, and regeneration. A figure that had existed for millennia before her transformation into the Gorgon we now know. Medusa, in this context, was not just a creature of horror, but a symbol of the life cycle itself. Both terrifying and sacred. She embodied the power of nature, the forces of death and rebirth, and the eternal, cyclical rhythms of existence. As Medusa's head fell, she gave birth, a final act of life, as she herself was consumed by death. From her severed neck, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the giant, sprang forth, children of the sea god Poseidon, whom she had been carrying within her all along. It is a powerful image, isn't it? Medusa, the monster, the feared and hunted, becoming a mother at the moment of her own demise. In this, she embodies the complex duality of life and death intertwined, a giver of life even as her own is extinguished. But to fully grasp this moment, we need to step back into the myth of Perseus, the young hero tasked with slaying Medusa. Perseus himself had a remarkable origin, born of Zeus and Dano, the daughter of King Acrisius. His grandfather, Acrisius, had been warned by a prophecy that his grandson would one day kill him. And in fear, he locked Dano and baby Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. However, the gods were watching over them. Poseidon guided the chest safely to the shores of the island of Seriphos, where they were found by a kind fisherman. Yet, the serenity of their new life was fleeting. The island's ruler, King Polydectes, set his sights on Dano, falling in love with her, though his version of love was nothing short of cruel possession. He enslaved her, and as Perseus grew older, he became determined to protect his mother. Polydectes, realizing Perseus would become a threat, devised a plan to send him on what seemed an impossible mission, to bring back the head of Medusa, the Gorgon. Perseus, the son of Zeus, was favored by the gods, and so he received divine help on his quest. Hades, god of the underworld, gave him a cap of invisibility. Hermes, the swift messenger, gifted him winged sandals to traverse land and sea quickly. Athena, wise and watchful, gave him a bronze shield polished to perfection. Its surface so reflective that it could serve as a mirror. And Hephaestus, the divine smith, forged a sharp sword for him to wield. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus set off to find Medusa, but locating her was no simple task. He sought the help of the Gree, 3 ancient sea hags who were born with grey hair and shared between them a single eye and tooth. The Gree, mysterious and powerful in their own right, reluctantly aided Perseus in his journey, for without their knowledge, he would never have found Medusa's lair. These strange sisters, who lived in the twilight between life and death, hinted at the shamanic underpinnings of the myth, much like Medusa herself, whose reflection in Athena's bronze shield recalls the ancient ritual tools used by priestesses and shamans for divination and protection. When Perseus finally arrived at Medusa's cave, he found her asleep. Holding up Athena's reflective shield, he crept toward the sleeping Gorgon, careful not to look at her directly, lest he be turned to stone. As her monstrous form lay silent, her snaky hair coiling even in her slumber, Perseus raised the sword and, with a single blow, severed her head. Yet this heroic act, on closer examination, feels less like a battle of courage and more like a tragic end to a misunderstood creature. Medusa, asleep and unaware, was struck down by a hero who never looked her in the eye. Unlike the tales of other Greek heroes who faced their enemies in open combat, this victory feels hollow, an act of violence against a figure who, in her transformation, had become more symbol than threat. And in that moment, as her head was cut from her body, life emerged from death. Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden warrior, were born. The symbolism here is striking. Medusa, once a beautiful maiden cursed for a crime she did not commit, now transformed into a feared monster, gave life even in her final breath. She was not just a figure of terror, but of creation, birthing new beings even as her own existence came to an end. Perseus, carrying Medusa's head in a satchel, embarked on his journey home. The image of him holding the head of the Gorgon, with its petrifying gaze still intact, speaks to the enduring power that Medusa's myth held even after her death. For even as a severed head, Medusa retained her terrifying abilities, capable of turning anyone who met her gaze to stone. It's a tragic irony, isn't it? Medusa, whose very existence was transformed by violence and loss, retained her might even in death, but it was no longer her own to control. The head, once feared because of its ability to petrify any who dared to meet its gaze, now became a tool for Perseus. He used it to rescue Andromeda and to settle disputes like the one with Phineus, who sought to reclaim his promised bride. But it wasn't just in battle that Medusa's head became a weapon. Perseus brought it back to King Polydectes, the tyrant who had enslaved his mother, and turned him to stone as well, setting Danae free. This theme of Medusa's power becoming more dangerous in the hands of men than in her own is deeply woven into the fabric of her story. From the moment Athena cursed her, Medusa was stripped of her autonomy, reduced to a monster in the eyes of the world. But it's only after her decapitation, when her body lies cold and lifeless, that her power reaches its full, uncontrollable potential. As Perseus parades her head across the Greek world, turning enemies to stone with ease, it becomes clear that Medusa is far more feared and far more lethal when separated from her own agency. In her living form, Medusa was a tragic figure, cursed and shunned, a victim of the gods' wrath. But once decapitated, she is rendered an object of terror, used by a man to his advantage, a tool to assert dominance and achieve victory. It's a haunting reflection of how the power of women, particularly those like Medusa, who were misunderstood and feared, can be co-opted and manipulated by those who would seek to control it. The Gree, too, reflect this theme. Though they were the only ones who knew the location of Medusa and her sisters, they were helpless in the face of Perseus's cunning. By stealing their shared eye and holding it ransom, Perseus took control of their knowledge, just as he would later take control of Medusa's power. And yet, the Gree were far more than just guardians of secrets. They were connected to Medusa, Scylla, and Theusa, part of the same ancient lineage of powerful, enigmatic women who existed outside the boundaries of society's understanding. Interestingly, ancient texts disagree on how many Gree there truly were. While Pseudo-Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca mentions 3 sisters, both Hesiod and Ovid describe only 2. Yet, in the majority of artwork and poetry that followed, they became 3 once more, a trinity of knowledge and fate, each linked to the shadowy, mystical world in which Medusa also resided. Aeschylus, too, offered a different take on these sisters, describing them not as old hags, but as beautiful swan-like figures. Their appearance as fluid and shifting as the myths that surrounded them. Perseus's interactions with these sisters are, like his defeat of Medusa, not exactly the stuff of heroic legend. Rather than facing them in a test of strength or bravery, he resorts to trickery and manipulation, stealing their eye and using it as leverage to force them into revealing the information he needs. It's a pattern that continues throughout his journey. Perseus, while undoubtedly brave, often uses deception and cunning rather than direct confrontation to achieve his goals. When he eventually comes upon Andromeda, a beautiful woman chained to a rock as a sacrifice to the sea monster Cetus, Perseus is once again thrust into the role of the hero. Slaying the sea monster to rescue the damsel in distress, he follows the archetypal path of the Greek hero. But even this heroic deed is colored by Perseus's possession of Medusa's head, which has now become an emblem of his power. He wishes to marry Andromeda, but she is already promised to Phineus, son of Belus. Phineus, of course, challenges Perseus for her hand, but the battle is over before it even begins. Perseus simply produces Medusa's head, turning Phineus to stone without lifting a sword. This use of Medusa's power, wielded so casually by Perseus, serves as a chilling reminder of how the autonomy of a woman, especially one as powerful as Medusa, can be stripped away and weaponized by others. Her head, once part of a living, breathing woman, is now reduced to a mere object, used to destroy anyone who stands in Perseus's way. By the time Perseus returns to Seriphos, Medusa's power has been fully transformed into a tool for vengeance. Polydectes, the king who had enslaved Perseus's mother and sent him on what was supposed to be an impossible mission, is no match for the Gorgon's petrifying gaze. With a simple flourish of the head, Perseus turns him to stone, liberating Danae at last. Medusa's image, particularly her mutilated body, has been manipulated and objectified throughout history, serving as a visual and symbolic reminder of how powerful women are often reduced to symbols of monstrosity or victimhood. Her fate, beheaded, her power weaponized and appropriated by Perseus, is echoed in the way male-dominated societies have often dealt with the autonomy of women. By cutting off her head, Perseus not only takes her life, but also turns her into an object of power that he alone can control. This dismembered image of Medusa is deeply tied to the idea that powerful women, no matter how they wield their power, are never safe from being exploited or reduced. The ancient myth of Medusa, as recounted by writers like Diodorus, Siculus, and Ovid, illustrates the way mythic women, especially those who challenge male authority or embody power, are systematically suppressed. Diodorus's depiction of Medusa as an Amazon queen, a ruler of powerful women in Libya, reinforces the idea of Medusa as a symbol of female leadership and power. But just as Perseus decapitated Medusa, these powerful women were utterly subdued, and their entire race destroyed by Heracles, who, according to the text, couldn't stand the idea of a nation being ruled by women. This narrative speaks volumes about the fears surrounding women's autonomy and leadership in the ancient world. Ovid's association of Medusa with Libya and the creation of snakes from her blood emphasizes the continuing impact of her power even after death. The snakes, symbols of wisdom, healing, and rebirth, littered the sands of Libya, a reminder that even in death, Medusa's influence persisted, uncontrolled and wild, much like the wisdom she represented. Her connection to serpents, which in many cultures symbolize knowledge and immortality, reinforces Medusa's association with powerful female figures who possess wisdom beyond the understanding of men. Interestingly, Lucian and Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, highlight another aspect of Medusa's power. Her beauty. Lucian claimed that it was Medusa's beauty, rather than any magical ability, that paralyzed men, suggesting that her very appearance was too overwhelming for the male gaze to handle. Pausanias recounted a similar story about Medusa as an Amazon queen. But this time Perseus buries her head in Argos to protect the city, demonstrating that even in death, Medusa's power was both feared and revered. Medusa's image, as classicist Jean-Pierre Vernant points out, became iconic in Greece, where she was represented in full frontal view from the 7th century BCE onward. The emphasis on the frontality of her face is significant. It's not just a way of showing her as a figure of power, but also as a mask that both conceals and reveals deeper truths about human fears, especially those surrounding women and their perceived threat to male dominance. Medusa's direct, unflinching gaze, similar to that of Dionysus, connects her to mortality and the divine power that affects all who meet it. This frontal gaze, which has captured the imagination of Western art and thought long after antiquity, has been reinterpreted and reimagined throughout various periods. In the medieval period, Medusa's story was often recast as a Christian allegory of virtue, triumphing over vice, with Perseus serving as the embodiment of righteous morality, slaying the sinful, monstrous Medusa. This narrative reaffirms the patriarchal idea of saving the world from dangerous, uncontrollable women. However, during the Renaissance and Romantic periods, Medusa's story took on more grotesque, symbolic forms, where her mutilated body became a reflection of societal fears about female power and agency. In art, Medusa's beheading serves as a visual representation of male control over female bodies. Her severed head, often depicted in all its grotesque glory, represents the disempowerment and objectification of women. By reducing Medusa to a monstrous figure whose only remaining power is her petrifying gaze, male artists and writers reinforce the idea that a woman's power must be neutralized, even in death, to maintain social order. This fascination with Medusa, particularly her decapitated head, is more than just a fascination with the monstrous. It's a way of dealing with the anxiety surrounding powerful women. Her story becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of a woman's autonomy and the lengths to which men will go to control, suppress, and exploit it. Gungian psychologist Eric Newman's association of Medusa's head with the womb in its frightening aspect speaks to a deeper cultural anxiety surrounding femininity. He linked the serpents and Medusa's protruding tongue with phallic imagery, underscoring the uncomfortable tendency in both Jungian and Freudian psychology to see women through a male-centric lens. This interpretation casts Medusa as a terrible mother, a projection of male fears about the feminine, reinforcing the trope of women as inherently threatening. Psychologists of that era, obsessed with these kinds of symbolic connections, failed to grasp Medusa's broader significance and her role as a victim rather than a purely menacing figure. What's often ignored in these male-focused analyses is the fact that Medusa, as a mythic figure, is herself primarily a victim. She endures sexual assault by Poseidon, is cursed by Athena for a crime she didn't commit, and ultimately becomes a target for Perseus's mission of slaying her, despite having done nothing wrong after her transformation into a Gorgon. The male gaze, both in mythology and in psychoanalysis, has often reduced Medusa to a symbol of fear and danger, especially to men, when in fact her myth doesn't distinguish her victims by gender. Medusa's gaze can petrify anyone, whether human or animal, yet the patriarchal reading of the myth persists in emphasizing her as a threat only to men, sidestepping her own victimization. The idea of Medusa's petrifying gaze takes on an even more layered meaning when considered through the lens of judgment. Scholar Hazel Barnes argues that Medusa's gaze is so unsettling because it symbolizes a form of judgment from an external force, a gaze from outside oneself that cannot be controlled or predicted. This judgment strips individuals of their subjectivity, reducing them to objects in the world. It reveals the vulnerability and fragility of one's identity, both physical and psychological, as it reflects back one's fears, insecurities, and imperfections. For Perseus, confronting Medusa's gaze would mean facing this uncomfortable truth, something he is unable or unwilling to do. His reliance on Athena's mirror shield to avoid direct eye contact with her is symbolic of a deeper fear of being judged by a woman, of having his own subjectivity threatened by a gaze that reveals his own vulnerability. The act of destroying Medusa, specifically her gaze, can be seen as a symbolic attempt by men to eliminate the threat of the female gaze entirely. Scholar Bowers notes that men have historically feared the female gaze because it disrupts their sense of control and forces them to confront their own fragility. By eliminating Medusa, Perseus removes the power of female subjectivity that threatens to mirror back his own weaknesses. This mirrors a broader cultural tendency to silence or suppress women's perspectives in order to maintain male dominance and control. Interestingly, some scholars have drawn parallels between Medusa's gaze and myths surrounding menstruation. Aristotle, for example, believed in the corrupting influence of women and claimed that menstruating women could tarnish a bright mirror simply by looking at it, causing the mirror to develop a cloudy, bloody spot. This idea aligns with Medusa's petrifying gaze as a metaphor for the female body and its natural functions being viewed as dangerous or corruptive. In The Mirror of Medusa, Tobin Sievers delves into this connection, arguing that Medusa's and Athena's roles in the myth, as well as Medusa's and Perseus's, represent dualities or doubles. Sievers' study reflects how these characters serve as mirror images of one another, emphasizing the ways in which women's power is both feared and objectified by men. Athena, the goddess who punishes Medusa, is also seen as a powerful woman, but one who operates within the confines of patriarchal approval. She represents the acceptable face of female power, channeled in ways that support male-dominated structures. In contrast, Medusa's power is uncontrolled, dangerous, and outside the boundaries of societal norms. Perseus, too, can be seen as Medusa's double. He is a hero, celebrated for his accomplishments, but his actions are only possible because he exploits the power and vulnerability of women like Medusa and the Grey to achieve his goals. In this way, Medusa's myth reveals a deep contradiction. While female power is demonized, it is also coveted and instrumentalized by men. Medusa's enduring legacy, therefore, lies in this complex interplay between power, victimization, and objectification. Her gaze, which has the power to petrify, is both a symbol of her strength and a reflection of how women's power has historically been perceived as a threat to male authority. The fear surrounding her gaze speaks to a broader societal discomfort with women's autonomy, wisdom, and independence, and the lengths to which patriarchal systems will go to suppress it. Perseus, by wielding Medusa's severed head as a weapon, embodies the very monstrosity he sought to defeat. While Medusa herself never actively harmed anyone, Perseus turns her deadly gaze upon humanity, becoming the monster she was only in appearance. Her form justified fear and condemnation. Yet it was Perseus who committed monstrous acts, disguised as heroism simply because of his status. Pindar's odes illustrate this irony, where Perseus petrifies the entire island of Seriphus using Medusa's power, men and women alike, blurring the lines between hero and monster. Athena, as Medusa's parallel, further complicates the narrative. Athena, birthed from the head of Zeus, mirrors the birth of Medusa's children from her decapitated neck. As the most masculine of the goddesses, Athena stands in stark contrast to Medusa, who embodies chaos, danger, and the uncontainable erotic. According to poet Audre Lorde, the erotic is a profound force that resides within women, an unrecognized power that patriarchal structures seek to control or deflect. Perseus, unable to face the chaotic feminine, uses his shield to deflect Medusa's power, symbolically cutting off female autonomy and reducing Medusa's influence to mere weaponry. Medusa's tragic story, however, has resonated deeply within feminist spaces. She represents more than just a monstrous figure. She reflects the silenced woman, the woman demonized and dehumanized for her power and rage. As feminist writer Emily Culpeper noted, Medusa holds vital life-saving lessons for women about anger, survival, and resilience. Patricia Kleindien's Jopling also speaks to the deep connection artists and women feel toward Medusa, seeing in her both the victim and the silenced figure used to silence others. In the end, Medusa's story is one of profound irony. She was cursed, feared, and ultimately killed for a crime she never committed, and yet her power lived on, exploited by those who sought to suppress it. And in her story, countless women over the centuries have seen their own struggles, their own rage, and their own defiant strength. Good night. May your dreams be free from the fears that haunt, and may you rest knowing that even in silence, power endures.